26 as well as 27 are pass and retain. We are moving to file item 28. That's AB 1171. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1171 by Assemblymember Linder, enacting the public contracts.
Mr. Linder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. AB 1171 is back from the Senate for concurrence, where it took minor and clarifying amendments regarding highway expressway projects. I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Linder. Seeing no discussion or debate on this item, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll. Tally the vote. Ayes 68, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. File item 29, AB 1191. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1191 by Assemblymember Nazarian, enacting to land use.
Mr. Nazarian, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. AB 1191 is back from the Senate on concurrence. Since LA enacted its own Quimby ordinance, it has amassed a significant amount of interest off of Quimby fees collected due to local administrative lapses and absence of language in state statute on the use of Quimby interest. Senate amendments give the City of LA the flexibility to dispense of existing Quimby interest in an equitable manner. AB 1191 has received unanimous bipartisan support in the legislature and has no opposition from any organization. With that, I ask you kindly for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Nazarian. Seeing no discussion or debate on this item, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll. Tally the vote. Ayes 68, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. Members, we're moving to Assembly third reading. File item 31 is passed and retained. File item 32, ACR 66. Clerk will read.
Assembly Concurrent Resolution 66 by Assemblymember Bonta and others relative to Filipino-American History Month.
Mr. Bonta, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Today I rise to present ACR 66 to recognize October 2015 as Filipino-American History Month and the 428th anniversary of the first presence of Filipinos in the continental United States. As the first and only Filipino-American elected to the California State Legislature, I'm honored to present this resolution in celebration of the vibrant legacy and history of the approximately 3.5 million Filipinos currently residing in the United States. As many of you are aware, the largest number of Filipinos in the nation reside right here in California. The 1.5 million Filipinos currently living in the state constitute the largest and fastest growing Asian American population in our state. Filipino Americans have made tremendous contributions to our state and nation, from creating fairer and more just working conditions for workers, to proudly serving in our nation's military forces and protecting our country, to laboring in the fields to help build our critical agricultural industry, and much more. Many generations of Filipino Americans have made great sacrifices and helped to fundamentally shape the landscape of California and the country. Colleagues, I want to thank you for your support that you have already provided to help uplift Filipino American history right here in California. Many of you supported AB 123, signed into law in 2013, which ensures that the contributions of Filipino Americans to the California farm labor movement be recognized and be taught in our public schools. And this year, many of you supported AB 7, signed into law in June, to honor Filipino, California, and American hero and labor leader Larry Itliong with a State Day of Recognition. Colleagues, I hope that you will take the opportunity provided by Filipino American History Month to celebrate the accomplishments and contributions of our Filipino American community in California and in the U.S. Thank you for your consideration. I respectfully ask for your aye vote and ask that the first roll be open for co-authors. Salamat po.
Thank you, Mr. Bonta. Mr. David Chu, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, today I rise representing the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus in strong support of ACR 66 and the Filipino American History Month. Our Filipino brothers and sisters make up the largest population within our API community in our state and have weaved a rich history as laborers, nurses, teachers, soldiers, public servants, and business owners, among others. My district includes the International Hotel and the former Manila Town, important sites within our states and our Filipino-American community history. We need to honor that history in order to preserve it, and with that, I strongly urge your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Mr. Alejo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I also rise on behalf of the Latino Caucus in support of this important resolution. For many of us that grew up in the rural areas of California, many of our grandparents and our parents worked side by side with many Filipino workers in the agricultural fields. So it's only reasonable that many of us also recognize their hard work and contributions. And we also grew up in the same neighborhoods. My neighbor, while growing up, was a Filipino family that would take care of us when my parents were out working. And by the time they got back, they were the ones taking care of us, feeding us. And we kind of took care of each other as immigrant families. So for us, this is really meaningful. We all know that throughout American history, different waves of immigrants have come to work in California's agricultural fields. But during the 1930s and 20s, they brought in a group of Filipino farm workers known as the Manangs, but they couldn't bring their wives. The women couldn't come for the Philippines. There were single men working in all different parts of California. But in my hometown, just for the fact that they danced with an Anglo woman at a dance hall, it broke out into what was called the Watsonville anti-Filipino riots. And it was a very sad chapter in California history of attacks against the Filipino community, not only in Watsonville, but it was later in Salinas, it was in Stockton, it was other parts of the state. And I was very proud that just a few years ago that we authored a resolution apologizing for the first time in California history for the government, the state government's involvement during that sad chapter. So today their leaders, their children and their great-grandchildren are leaders in many different professions throughout California. So we have a lot to be proud of. But it's also important to recognize the sacrifices that came with that. It meant people standing up for what was right for the Filipino community. And now we have a legislator here that is able to bestow this recognition every October for the Filipino community throughout California. I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Alejo. Mr. Chavez, you are recognized.
I'd also like to stand and recognize the importance of recognizing the Filipino community to the California and our nations. But as a lot of you know, I'd like to take it from a military perspective. Back when the beginning of the World War II, one of the first countries that stood with us in the expansion to fight the expansion of the Japanese nation was the Filipinos. And they not only became the forefront of the Battle of the Pacific, many of them went to the fields and the jungles and continued to fight until the end of the war. The military in the Filipino country has a very strong, rich heritage. Permission to read, sir?
Without objection.
A lot of us may not know that retired Major General Natilio Arcama III was the first Filipino Marine general who held the third highest position in the United Nations as Assistant Secretary General. He was recalled to active duty and extended service as a force commander and head of missions of the United Nations Distinguished Observer Force in the Golan Heights on the troubled border of Syria and Israel until February 13, 2012. Truly a wonderful country, truly a wonderful people, but also as one Marine recognizing the military accomplishments of the Filipinos, great warriors. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chavez. Seeing no additional discussion or debate, Mr. Bonta, you may close if you wish.
Thank you, colleagues, for your thoughtful and supportive comments. I respectfully ask for your aye vote, and I'd like to open the first roll for co-authors.
Mr. Bonta is asking the first roll be open for co-authors. With that, clerk will open the roll. Members, this is for co-authors. Co-authors adding on ACR 66. Co-authors, members, there are 71 co-authors added to the measure. Without objection, we may take a voice vote on this item. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. Moving to file item 33. That's AJR 13. Clerk will read.
Assembly Joint Resolution 13 by Assemblymember Ridley Thomas relative to the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Mr. Ridley Thomas, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, I rise to present AJR 13, which commemorates the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And what an interesting year in which we find ourselves, where we have conversations across this nation about voter suppression, where we have concerns in California about turnout and access to the ballot and the franchise and the fundamental protections that many people in this country, some of whom lived in California, fought, bled, and died to achieve. I'm pleased to be a part of a continuum of leaders who have benefited greatly from the Voting Rights Act. I can literally say I would not be here serving in this body if not for the Voting Rights Act. There are a number of protections ensured under that legislation to make sure that we don't have things like vote vouchers for moral character, or poll taxes, or literacy tests, or insidious provisions that, in fact, restrict access to the franchise. There is, in fact, a number of efforts in the federal level to ensure that the Voting Rights Act is strengthened, is modernized, and is protected. And we ask respectfully for support of this measure in order that these provisions are reenacted. Some of you are familiar with particular sections that have been invalidated or called into question by the United States Supreme Court. In order to respond to the court, we hope through this resolution and other efforts led by the Congressional Black Caucus that the protections of the Voting Rights Act will be reinstated and reinforced, modernized, and adapt to a changing demographic reality, that it still ensures that communities have access to the ballot box and can choose and can make voting decisions that allow them to choose representatives of their own choosing. That is simply a fundamental right and responsibility of government to ensure protection and access to the franchise in a democracy. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would respectfully request an aye vote of AJR 13. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ridley Thomas. Mr. Alejo, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. In light of the sad passing of one of the greatest civil rights leaders, Julian Bond, just a couple of days ago, it's important for us to not take this moment in honoring the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. I think you would be pleased to see that the California legislature is taking a moment, not only commemorating that August 6th signing of the Voting Rights Act 50 years ago, but more important, the call to action. As we all know, there was a horrible U.S. Supreme Court case, Shelby County case, that it eliminated one of the most important provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and that was Sections 4 and 5, the pre-clearance requirement. And since then, there's been inaction in Congress to create a new formula, reinstitute those protections for voters across the country. But as my colleague just pointed out, many of us are here today because of the Voting Rights Act. It was first used to strike down discriminatory electoral systems and barriers throughout the South, but it was later used in the courts to strike down barriers against Latino voters. In my district alone, there was 2 landmark Supreme cases that were fought all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Lopez versus Monterey County, they got the first Latino judges elected in Monterey County. And then there was Gomez versus the city of Watsonville that abolished at-large election systems and instituted district elections for the first time. And as a result of that, we have a city council that is much more reflective of the people in our district. But I did want to mention the names of those whose names are often not mentioned, including a young Latina, Dolores Cruz Gomez, who was the lead plaintiff in that case, who had the courage to stand up because Latinos ran but could never win office. But she was later demonized. She was attacked. Her landlord attempted to evict her. She would not live in the new drawn city council district when she was running for city council. She never won that campaign. She never won public office. But because of the courage of Dolores Cruz Gomez, today many young Latinos in Watsonville are now able to serve on the city council. We had the first 2 Latinas elected to the school board, but it started many years ago with courageous people who stood up and asked that we could have a better system of voting and elections so that everyone has a fair chance to serve in office. So it's in these moments that we recognize those peoples who had that kind of courage, but yet whose names are often not mentioned. But that was in my hometown. But those same courageous people exist in all parts of this country. So I want to call, in memory of Julian Bond, that we all vote in favor of this resolution in honor of the Voting Rights Act, and to call to Congress to take action to reinstitute the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Thank you, Mr. Alejo. Ms. Chang, you are recognized from your desk.
Mr. Speaker and members, I rise in support of this resolution. The Voting Rights Act, which abolished poll taxes, literacy tests, and other voting requirements that were designed to prevent minorities from exercising their right to vote, a right guaranteed under the enactment of the 15th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act goes to the heart of what our democracy should be about, a pluralistic society that ensures equal rights for all. And in this case, it is one of the most sacred rights in our democracy, the right to vote. The road to the Voting Rights Act was not easy, and this resolution acknowledges those who gave the ultimate sacrifice to fight for their freedoms. And I'd like to thank the author for bringing this forward and urge all of us to support this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chang. Mr. Levine, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speakers and members. I rise in support on behalf of the Jewish Caucus of AJR 13 and thank the author for bringing this important resolution forward. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is a straightforward document. The Act states no voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard practice or procedure shall be imposed or applied by any state or political subdivision to deny or abridge the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. The Voting Rights Act has had a profound effect on civil rights in this great nation. Passage of the Voting Rights Act was the direct result of African Americans standing up and demanding to be heard. Joining them in the civil rights movement were progressive thinking Americans of all walks of life. This included active and engaged Jewish Americans and Jewish leaders. Jewish activists participated in the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. Leaders of the Reform movement were arrested with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine, Florida in 1964, and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched arm in arm with Dr. King in the March on Selma. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 both were drafted in the conference room of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism under the aegis of the Leadership Conference. The Jewish community continues to actively protect civil rights, and our work is not yet done. Discrimination against people of color, women, people of faith, LGBT Americans, and the disabled continues to exist. Today, we must all stand up against discrimination in voting, housing, and employment. As we fight for civil rights today, we must never forget the struggles endured and the efforts made 50 years ago to pass the Voting Rights Act. I urge your aye vote on this important resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. Ms. Garcia, you are recognized from your desk.
Good afternoon, members and speaker. I rise today as the Vice Chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus and as the beneficiary of the Voting Rights Act. Many of us would not be here if it were not for the work in the past century that allowed women and men of color to exercise their right to vote, and for the Voting Rights Act that kept discriminatory practices away from our polling places and gave all people, regardless of gender or color, the opportunity to elect the candidate of their choosing. Susan B. Anthony said, "There will never be equality until women themselves help to make the laws and elect lawmakers." This profound statement was said more than a century ago. Over the last 50 years, we have made progress. Today, we have more women than we did when Susan B. Anthony spoke those words. And we have 3 out of 4 of our leaders in the legislature who are women. But here in this House, only 19 of the 80 members of this body are women, less than 24%. We have a lot to be proud of, but clearly we still have a lot of work to do. I urge all of us to take this opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to ensuring equity in our democratic process. I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Mr. Jones-Sawyer, you are recognized.
Members, I rise today in support of AJR 13, which commemorates the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. As chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, we know full well not only how important this is, but the sacrifices that led to the Voting Rights Act. 50 years ago, on August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law to break down legal barriers at the state level and at the local level that were keeping African Americans and people of color from exercising their constitutional right to vote. That right to vote was hard fought, and many people gave their lives to ensure that everyone could exercise their constitutional right. Many of us can't even imagine what it's like to try to get your right to vote and ultimately be beaten, to be lynched, to be killed, have burning crosses on your lawn because you just want to exercise the fundamental right that every American has, which is to vote. And I believe the people who thought that they needed to impede African Americans and others from enjoying that right knew full well that not only in education, but especially in voting, that the power structure that kept people down for centuries and centuries would eventually be eroded, because now everyone would be able to enjoy the right to vote for their own members in their elected offices, but more important, be able to decide their lives legally and through the political system. 50 years later, we have seen the Voting Rights Act eroded by the courts, and there are still too many ways in which people are discouraged from voting. The California Legislative Black Caucus is committed to ensuring that our sacred right to vote is protected and expanded. Members, I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Jones-Lawyer. Mr. Williams, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, members, on behalf of the API Legislative Caucus, I stand in support of this AGR to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and I commend the author for wonderful, if tragic, timing on it to celebrate the life of a great civil rights leader. Asian and Pacific Islander Americans voters nearly doubled from 2 million in 2000 to 3.9 million in 2012, and over 30 countries and ethnic groups are represented in these numbers, speaking over 100 different languages. Language access and the anti-discrimination provisions in the Voting Rights Act have been pivotal in ensuring that APIs have been able to cast their ballot. Despite gains that have been made over the 50 years since the enactment of the VRA, there is still more work to be done. A UC study showed that only 17.3% of eligible Latinos and 18.4% of eligible Asian Americans voted in the 2014 general election in California. And, members, this is a current issue. There are still efforts throughout this country to undermine people's right to vote, whether that is consolidation of precincts to make your polling places farther from your residence, whether that is provisions to clean up the voter rolls or other measures. There are still efforts to disenfranchise people from having the right to vote. This resolution is a reminder that proper implementation of the Voting Rights Act is essential to ensuring that communities that have historically been disenfranchised can participate in this democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Dr. Eggman, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, good afternoon, members. I rise as the chair of the LGBT caucus in support of AGR 13. This is an incredibly important event, I think, in our history, and we know that there were many LGBT people who took part in that, even though for the most part they had to remain in the closet to do so, as everybody fought for their rights, for freedom and to be able to vote. I just want to briefly mention the path to get there was not just as simple, there was a vote for people to be able to vote. It was a long path, a long and arduous journey. I had occasion to be in Little Rock a couple weeks ago, and I took it upon myself to go visit Central High and to pay homage to the Little Rock Nine who were there. And the school was getting ready to start there. It was 100 degrees. It was 112 with the humidity factor while we were there. And I really just felt those students, that bravery of those students who traversed that ground into that school, not just for themselves, but for everybody. And that was in 1954. And there was these continuous acts of people standing up to say, we deserve our place in America too, that was able to lead now to the Voting Rights Act and the work that we still have to do. But I stand today in proud support of this and to commemorate these 50 years and know that we still have a long way to go.
Mr. Hernandez.
Mr. Speaker and members, today I rise in support of Assembly Joint Resolution 13, which recognizes the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act has been an important tool in ensuring Americans from all backgrounds have access to fair representation and greatly improve access to the ballot. Voting is the best way to ensure that our citizens have equal voice in government. It is of utmost importance that we continue this fight. This fight has been going on for many, many decades, and let's be honest. There are government officials, sitting mayors, sitting supervisors, sitting state lawmakers, in this state included, that continue to make this path in the realization of the Voting Rights Act to fully materialize. We as a body, as a whole, as an aggregate, can continue to push in the right direction. I believe AGR 13 sends a strong message from the California legislature, and let's do it in a bipartisan way, that we stand for all those goals. We want to engage all our citizenry, regardless of their background. Let's bring it home.
Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. All discussion having ceased, Mr. Ridley Thomas, you may close.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank each and every one of you for listening intently. It speaks to the merits of this proposal, the importance of this proposal, the symbolic and practical implications of what we're discussing about when we mention the franchise. Two old hymns of the church come to mind, black gospel songs. One is that I and some of you must have woke up this morning with your minds stayed on freedom, because that's what we're talking about when we discuss the franchise. The colleague from Marin County talked about discrimination in housing and employment and in voting, fundamental things. And it's not, I don't think, any coincidence that we also celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Watts unrest. And when folks are crouched and disenfranchised, you find a great deal of tension, and sometimes that cauldron bubbles over, and you have a very long, hot summer. So in order to diffuse some of that heat, we want to make sure that everybody can have access to the broad scope of the American dream. The second gospel refrain that would come to mind is that we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. It is an active process. We are part of a continuum of those who are seeking to advance inclusionary practices, and this resolution, believe it or not, sends a strong message to our colleagues in Congress who, despite what a columnist in a prominent state newspaper of record said this week, are really following our lead on measures such as this and others, because this body knows how to get it done. It knows how to be inclusive. It knows how to be regionally respectful, because this is a diverse state, a diverse economy. And if we can accomplish it here, if we can increase voter turnout by reducing restrictions to voting, by promoting outreach and inclusionary efforts with our local, special district, and statewide elections, make sure that we support our Secretary of State in his efforts to modernize our voting system, to promote automatic voter registration, to use technology to make sure that people can easily access the vote and get information on candidacies in election, we will have made a unique improvement to democracy, and I think that our service will not be in vain. With that, I would ask that the roll be open for co-authors, and thank you all for your positive consideration of this proposal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Ridley Thomas is asking that the first roll be open for co-authors. With that, clerk will open the roll. Members wishing to add as co-authors on AJR 13. This is for co-authors members. Clerk will close the roll. There are 72 co-authors added. A joint resolution requires a roll call vote. With that, the clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll. Tally the vote. Ayes 74, no 0. Resolution is adopted.